My name is Marin Whitlock. I am 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and someone who has spent a lifetime trying to make those I love feel secure and cherished. I have gray-streaked hair I keep pulled into a neat bun, hands worn from decades of grading papers and folding laundry, and a heart that still believes in the goodness of people even when it is tested. It was a Tuesday morning in Charleston, and sunlight streamed through the lace curtains in my kitchen, catching the steam from my freshly brewed coffee. I had poured it carefully into my favorite mug, the one with the little lighthouse painted on the side, and set it beside the phone. I had been thinking all week about the trip. Clarissa had been talking about a Caribbean getaway for months, a family vacation I had insisted on joining. Not to intrude, but because I wanted to be part of her happiness. I had even splurged a little, using part of my modest retirement savings to book flights and a hotel she had raved about. This trip was meant to be the highlight of my year, a chance to make memories that might last longer than the wrinkles on my hands or the ache in my knees. The phone rang. I wiped my hands on my apron and reached for it, smiling as soon as I saw her name flash across the screen. Clarissa. My chest tightened with the mix of excitement and nervous anticipation only a mother could feel. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "So, what time should I meet you at the airport?" There was a pause long enough to make my stomach twist. Then a laugh, sharp and unfamiliar, came through the line. "Mom, we're already in the Caribbean," Clarissa said, her voice tinged with amusement, as if I had asked something absurd. "We left yesterday. Didn't Lucinda tell you I felt the mug slip slightly in my hands?" The coffee sloshed over the rim, but I barely noticed. My mind refused to process her words at first. Already in the Caribbean. Without me. Every plan, every dollar, every anticipation gone in an instant. I managed to croak out, "You're kidding." "Right, no." "Mom," she said, still laughing softly. "We wanted it to be just the immediate family. Nothing complicated. You know how you get with hotels. The laughter, the casual dismissal, the tone that carried no regret, cut through me like a knife. All those nights spent counting pennies to afford her wedding gifts. The tuition payments. The car repairs. The little emergencies over the years they had led to this. And yet, in her mind, I was just an afterthought. A figure to be managed. I sank into the chair by the kitchen table, gripping the edge as though it could anchor me against the surge of betrayal. For the first time in decades, the certainty that my love was enough to guarantee inclusion felt hollow and laughable. I had spent my life trying to create joy for others, only to discover that my presence was optional, my contributions invisible. I set the mug down, the heat from the coffee fading into nothing, and stared at the floor. My suitcase, half packed and still by the door, seemed suddenly absurd. A pang of both grief and fury burned through me. I whispered to myself, steadying my voice, "This isn't over." With that, I began to think about the next steps, how I would reclaim a sense of control that had been quietly slipping away for years. The Caribbean sun was shining somewhere over the ocean, but I was not there. And that, I realized, was the moment everything began to change. I remember the weeks leading up to the Caribbean trip as vividly as if they were yesterday, even though time has a way of softening some edges while sharpening others. My mornings were spent at the small desk by the kitchen window, laptop open, spreadsheets and travel sites filling the screen, plane tickets, hotel reservations, excursions I checked, double-checked, and triple-checked every detail. Each confirmation email felt like a tiny promise of adventure, a tangible proof that soon I would be walking beside my daughter, breathing in the salt-tinged air, laughing at the same silly things we always laughed about. I had insisted on booking a luxury resort, one that Clarissa had scrolled through endlessly on her phone, highlighting the infinity pool and private beach access. I remembered her excitement the day she called to show me photos. "Maren, this is perfect," she said, eyes bright. I had smiled, nodding, imagining us sipping fruity drinks under an umbrella while the Caribbean waves lapped lazily against the shore. I allowed myself to indulge in that fantasy, telling myself that a little splurge was worth the memories we would make together. Outfits were a different kind of preparation. I wandered through boutiques along King Street, examining sundresses and linen pants, feeling the delicate fabrics between my fingers. One dress caught my eye immediately, a soft coral color with a gentle flare that would sway in the ocean breeze. The price tag made my chest tighten. It was almost half of a month's pension, but I justified it. It wasn't for vanity. It was for the shared moments with my daughter, the photos that would hang in her memory and mine. I tried it on, twirled in front of the mirror, and imagined her standing beside me, laughing. The excitement that bubbled in my chest was intoxicating, and for a few moments, the financial weight vanished. Packing became its own ritual. I laid out my suitcase 3 days in advance, folding each piece of clothing with care, arranging toiletries and sunscreen, tucking in a paperback novel I had been saving for months. I even included a small notebook, thinking I might jot down reflections or sketches while listening to the waves. Everything had its place. I had always loved order, and in this preparation, I found a kind of calm, a feeling that the world was right, even if only temporarily. Every penny I spent, every careful plan, was a sacrifice. Yes, but it was also a labor of love. I thought about the years of supporting Clarissa's school expenses, emergencies, even the small luxuries she demanded without hesitation, and I didn't regret any of it. This trip felt like a culmination of all that effort, a reward for a lifetime of giving, a chance to bask in the glow of her happiness, and, perhaps, my own. At night, I would sit in the living room, suitcase ready by the door, sipping chamomile tea. I could almost hear the ocean waves, almost feel the warmth of the Caribbean sun on my skin. My heart raced with anticipation. I imagined our laughter echoing across the resort terrace, the clinking of glasses, and the smiles that would stretch across both our faces. It never occurred to me that all this careful planning, all these sacrifices, could be disregarded in an instant. That one phone call could render weeks of excitement meaningless. That I could be left on the edge of my kitchen floor, suitcase by the door, imagining a trip that had already begun without me. And yet, even in that fragile disappointment, the memories of my preparation, my care, my effort, my love remained a testament to who I was and what I believed in. I sank into the worn armchair by the window, the Caribbean sun nowhere in sight, and let my thoughts drift back over the decades I had devoted to Clarissa. The vivid memory of the trip only amplified the weight of everything I had given her over the years. The sacrifices that had built her life while quietly hollowing mine. Each dollar, each favor, each sleepless night whispered a story of love and, increasingly, exploitation. There were the small things, the ones that never seemed to add up at the time but had silently accumulated into an ocean of cost. Birthday gifts she never remembered, last-minute emergencies that required immediate cash, school fees, and tutoring. I remembered the tuition check I had written when she was in college, balancing it against my own meager retirement contributions, thinking that money was an investment in her future. I had given it willingly, of course, but it had come at the cost of missed vacations, deferred repairs, and quiet meals when I could barely afford them. Then there were the bigger sacrifices: the first car, the engagement ring, the down payment for her apartment. I had watched her eyes light up at each one, a spark of happiness I believed I had created. I had justified it, telling myself these were gifts from the heart, not obligations. But even as I had given, a quiet pattern had begun to emerge. Every request, every need became more than a request. It became a test of my willingness to sacrifice my comfort, my security, my very independence. I remembered the day she called, tears in her voice, asking for help with a deposit on a new apartment. I had emptied the envelope I had been saving for myself, imagining that in doing so, I was securing her happiness. The money left my hand, my bank account, and the satisfaction I felt was immediate, almost intoxicating. But in the months that followed, another need arose, then another, each one arriving like clockwork, each one a gentle, insistent tug on my conscience. I never hesitated. My love was instinctive, automatic. I had become a living conduit for their desires. There were vacations I had postponed, repairs I had delayed, medical checkups I had skipped so I could meet their demands. I counted it all silently now, an account of devotion that seemed both infinite and endlessly depleting. 5, 10, 15 years of life compressed into a ledger of generosity. Each payment, each effort, each sleepless night had been a gift, yes, but also a silent surrender of my autonomy. And all of it had been met with smiles, gratitude sometimes, but increasingly with entitlement. I could feel the cumulative weight of it in my chest, a mix of pride and exhaustion, love and quiet resentment. The truth was that each act of giving had come with a cost I had barely registered at the time: my freedom to decide, my right to prioritize my own needs, and my sense of security that I had spent a lifetime cultivating. The ledger of sacrifices was etched not just in numbers, but in the ache in my back, the gray in my hair, the quiet loneliness of nights when I wondered if anyone truly saw me. Not as a source of support, but as a person. And yet, I had never hesitated. Each dollar spent had felt like an extension of my love, proof that I would always protect, nurture, and provide. But now, in the stillness of my living room, suitcase still by the door, the realization struck me with the clarity of a lighthouse beam. My devotion had been measured and claimed, itemized and consumed, until I was no longer simply a mother. I had become a resource, an invisible ledger of wealth and care, used with precision, valued only for what I could provide. The Caribbean trip had been the latest illustration. I had planned, spent, and anticipated it with joy, only to discover that my presence was deemed unnecessary. My efforts, my money, my excitement, all irrelevant to them, all invisible. The truth I could no longer deny was raw and unyielding for decades. I had given everything, and in return, I had been taken for granted. The phone rested in my hand like a burning coal, its weight heavier than any physical object I had ever carried. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the green button, as if hesitation alone could soften the blow of what I was about to hear. I dialed Clarissa again, needing to understand, needing her to acknowledge what I already felt: that I had been sidelined, excluded from a trip I had funded, planned, and imagined for months. Her voice came through before the phone even finished ringing. Light, clipped, casual. "Hey, Mom," she said, the tone almost cheerful, as if greeting me was nothing more than an obligatory formality. My chest tightened, the muscles taut as wire. "Clarissa, I don't understand," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I thought we were leaving together." I thought, "Oh, Mom," she interrupted gently, the word dripping with that same patronizing softness I had come to recognize over the years. "We just wanted a quiet trip with the immediate family. You know how you get with plans. It's nothing personal." Nothing personal. The words hit harder than any shout, any accusation could have. I could hear the faint clinking of glasses and laughter behind her voice, and suddenly, the vibrant scenes of sun, sand, and water felt like a cruel taunt rather than a promise. I had spent weeks imagining us walking along the beach together, and in a single breath, those images dissolved into air. Her husband's voice joined in then, warm but calculated, as if practicing charm for maximum effect. "Yeah, Mom, it's just us. We thought it would be easier that way." There was no hesitation, no trace of embarrassment, no acknowledgement of the effort I had made, just matter-of-fact dismissal. I gripped the edges of the counter to keep from tipping over, from letting the anger overwhelm me completely. Each word they spoke, casual, almost amused, carved a space between us that felt impossibly wide. For years, I had poured my life, my savings, my energy into supporting them. Tuition, emergencies, car repairs, engagement parties, wedding expenses. Little indulgences, I had handled them all. Every dollar, every ounce of care, taken as if it were due, owed, expected. And, "You didn't think to tell me?" I asked finally, my voice a thread of incredulity, disbelief, and hurt tangled together. Clarissa laughed lightly, a sound meant to smooth over the tension. "Oh, Mom, it didn't seem necessary. We didn't want to stress you out. You get so wound up over the tiniest things." I sank into my chair, the heat from my earlier coffee long gone, my hands trembling. I could feel the quiet weight of years of undervaluation pressing down on me, a pattern that had stretched across decades. I had believed love and devotion were enough, that my contributions would ensure my presence mattered. But here, in the calm, airy tone of a phone call, I realized the truth: my value had been measured solely by what I could provide. When I stopped providing, I became invisible. I ended the call, the silence settling around me like a dense fog. The room was still, but my mind buzzed with the echoes of their dismissal, the realization of my own marginalization, and the slow, simmering heat of anger that would not be ignored. For the first time in years, I felt the unmistakable stirrings of resolve. They might have overlooked me before, but I would no longer be a silent accomplice to my own erasure. I sank deeper into the armchair, my hands folded over each other as the weight of memory settled around me. The kitchen was quiet, sunlight slanting through the blinds, but inside, a storm had been quietly building for decades, and I was only now beginning to recognize its shape. Each gift, each favor, each emergency I had rushed to cover, taken together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I thought about the early years, when Clarissa was little, and the first time she had asked for money for a school trip I hadn't anticipated. I had handed over the cash, proud to give her the experience I had missed as a child. Then there was the car accident in high school, the tuition payments for college, the engagement party, and the wedding. Each one had felt like a loving gesture, a mother providing for her child. And yet, looking back, I realized that love had been measured against my willingness to sacrifice, and the sacrifice had been assumed, taken for granted, and never fully acknowledged. The realization hit hardest when I considered the more recent years. I had planned the Caribbean trip meticulously, counting each dollar carefully, ensuring that every detail matched Clarissa's dreams. And yet, in a single phone call, I had been reduced to an optional participant. My efforts invisible. My presence deemed unnecessary. It wasn't just disappointment. It was a pattern I had ignored for too long. A lifetime of giving, of prioritizing their happiness over my own, had allowed entitlement to flourish unchecked. I could see it now, as clearly as if someone had drawn a diagram. Every request, every favor, every crisis that required my intervention had strengthened a structure of dependency. Clarissa and her husband had learned to expect it, to manipulate it without even thinking, as if the world owed them my compliance. The lines were so neatly drawn, so subtle, that I hadn't noticed them forming, hadn't questioned the rhythm of giving and taking that had defined our relationship. A quiet anger rose in me, tempered by a lingering sorrow. I had loved deeply, wholeheartedly, without conditions, believing that care and generosity were enough to ensure closeness, loyalty, and respect. And yet, in their eyes, I had been a resource to be tapped, a support system to be relied upon but never fully seen. My devotion had been monetized, my sacrifices treated as debts to be collected at their convenience. I felt a strange mix of clarity and grief. The years of unquestioning giving had taught me patience, resilience, and empathy, but they had also left me vulnerable, naive, and unprepared for the stark realization of how deeply I had been exploited. The anger was clean, crystalline, cutting through the sadness, giving me a focus I had not felt in years. I closed my eyes, letting the memory of every overlooked effort, every invisible gesture, every silent sacrifice wash over me. For the first time, I allowed myself to see the full picture. The generosity I had offered was unquestionable, the pattern of exploitation undeniable, and the lesson unmistakable. I had been giving without boundaries, and the consequence had been that my own life, my own needs, had been quietly erased. And yet, for the first time, I felt a spark of something new resolve. I would no longer allow this pattern to continue. The awareness was heavy, but it carried with it the seed of power. I had spent a lifetime giving. Now it was time to reclaim myself. I sat at the edge of the kitchen table, my palms pressed against the cool wood, staring at the phone as if it might offer answers I was too afraid to hear. The sun had climbed higher, yet the room felt dim, suffused with the weight of betrayal. My chest was tight, not from fear, but from the building storm inside me. Years of small humiliations, endless sacrifices, and unacknowledged devotion coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. I could no longer remain the passive provider for a family that saw me as a convenience. Every memory I had held close the college tuition, the car repairs, the wedding gifts. The emergency loans suddenly felt like chains. I had wrapped myself in the illusion of love, thinking that giving freely meant connection, that my sacrifices would ensure closeness. But the truth was glaring. Now my generosity had been treated as entitlement. My kindness had been exploited with the quiet precision of someone who knows exactly how far they can push, and I had allowed it. Anger surged through me, hot and raw, mingling with a sense of humiliation I could no longer suppress. I thought of Clarissa's laugh that morning, light, almost mocking, as she told me they were already in the Caribbean. The words echoed in my mind. We just wanted a quiet trip with the immediate family. Quiet, yes, but for them, invisible. For me, I had been careful, meticulous, eager to create joy, and yet my effort had been rendered meaningless in a single sentence. I felt my hands tremble not from fear, but from the force of emotions I had kept restrained for decades. The quiet despair of years of unreciprocated devotion flared into something almost primal. I would no longer be their ATM, their invisible caretaker, their perpetual safety net. I realized that the hurt and humiliation I had tolerated for so long could be transformed into resolve, a decisive assertion of my own worth and autonomy. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and walked to the window. The Charleston streets below were calm, oblivious to my inner turmoil. I imagined the waves of the Caribbean, their sunlit beauty mocking the fact that I would not be there. And in that imagined contrast, I felt clarity. This was the moment when patience ended and action began. I remembered every dollar I had spent over the years, every sleepless night, every meal skipped, every opportunity deferred. Each act of giving had been part of a pattern I had allowed to form, a pattern that prioritized everyone else's happiness above my own dignity. I had been generous to a fault, blind to the exploitation. And now I saw it with piercing clarity. The realization hardened into decision. I would no longer allow my love to be measured by the size of my wallet, nor my presence by the whims of others. I would not wait for gratitude or acknowledgement. I would claim my own power, establish boundaries, and ensure that my remaining resources and, more importantly, my sense of self could not be taken without my consent. I exhaled, a long, slow release, feeling for the first time in years the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. The anger had sharpened into purpose. The humiliation had forged determination. I would no longer be invisible, no longer complicit in my own erasure. Sitting back down at the table, I reached for my laptop, opening the browser to my bank's online portal. The screen glowed before me. A small digital frontier of control I had never fully exercised. And in that moment, I knew the course of my life was about to shift. The time for patience had passed. The time for action had arrived. The house was quiet. Too quiet. As if even the walls were holding their breath in anticipation of what I was about to do. I sat at my dining table, laptop open, the cursor blinking on the bank login screen like a metronome counting down to the moment of reckoning. The plan I had been forming in my mind for days, weeks even, was finally within reach. This was not a reckless impulse. It was the first act of autonomy I had claimed in decades. I typed in my credentials carefully, the screen reflecting in my glasses as I double-checked every detail. The account that had been tapped, drained, and relied upon for every whim, every trip, every emergency, would no longer be theirs to exploit. $5 million, my hard-earned, painstakingly saved money, was about to move out of reach. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, a delicate act of defiance against a lifetime of expectations. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of the emotions swirling inside me. Anger, yes, but also a deep, simmering pride. I had been invisible for too long, a constant provider whose presence was measured only by the convenience I afforded. Today, I would assert that I mattered not because they had acknowledged it, not because they had earned it, but because it was mine to claim. I paused for a moment, reflecting on every dollar I had spent over the years for Clarissa and her husband. Tuition, apartments, weddings, gifts, emergencies. They had been a steady stream, a river that never ceased, flowing from my account to theirs. I had justified each transaction as love, as devotion, as duty. But now I saw it clearly. My generosity had been weaponized, my kindness taken for granted. And yet, I had given it willingly, blinded by the illusion that love alone could guarantee respect. The confirmation page blinked on the screen. I reviewed the numbers, carefully account details. Routing. The exact sum. My breath caught as I pressed the final button. The funds began their journey to a new account I controlled completely, hidden behind layers of security and anonymity. In that moment, the numbers on the screen were more than digits. They were proof of my agency, my first tangible act of self-protection. As the transfer processed, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The anger that had burned so fiercely in recent days transformed into a quiet, determined satisfaction. I was no longer passive. I had taken control. I had claimed my dignity. Every story I had told myself about sacrifice, about love as obligation, began to shift. Love was no longer a transaction. It had to coexist with respect and recognition. The realization made me smile, a small, private curl of satisfaction that no one could see. For the first time in years, I felt power, not the loud, domineering kind, but a quiet, resolute authority over my own life and possessions. It was thrilling in its subtlety. The house remained silent, and yet I imagined the ripple it would create once Clarissa discovered the balance of her dependency had been irrevocably altered. I leaned back in my chair, letting the relief wash over me. I thought of the long years spent bending, yielding, and anticipating needs that were never reciprocated. That chapter of my life was not erased, but it was redefined. The funds were safe, untouchable, and for the first time, I was free from the anxiety that had shadowed every interaction with them for so long. And yet, beneath the relief, a sharper edge remained. This act was not only protection, it was warning. I would no longer be invisible, no longer a silent participant in my own subjugation. I had claimed the right to decide, the right to protect, the right to exist on my own terms. And with that knowledge, I felt an unfamiliar exhilaration, a fierce, quiet power that made my pulse quicken. I closed the laptop, the confirmation receipt saved and backed up, tucked safely where only I could find it. My hands finally stilled, my heart finally steady. The first battle in reclaiming my life was won. The journey ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in decades, I knew I would face it on my own terms. The first message arrived early in the morning, a flurry of texts, missed calls, and emails, all from Clarissa. I saw her name flashing across my phone, and for a fleeting moment, my chest tightened with a pang of guilt. But as I unlocked the screen, reading the words cascading down like wildfire, guilt gave way to a quiet, crystalline satisfaction. Mom, the money, it's gone. Where did it go? Her voice was frantic when she finally called, laced with disbelief and panic. I held the phone to my ear, letting the chaos of her tone wash over me. I could hear the tremor beneath her fury, the sharp edges of anger hiding a thread of vulnerability. She had expected compliance, the same automatic generosity that had fueled her lifestyle for years. And suddenly, it wasn't there. "What are you talking about?" Clarissa, I asked, my tone calm, measured, carrying none of the panic she expected. My voice was an anchor in the storm she had unleashed. "The account. It's empty. 5 million Marin. This isn't possible. Did you touch it?" Her words were rapid fire, almost frantic, as if speed alone could undo what had been done. "Yes, I did," I admitted simply, not a hint of hesitation. "I moved it. It's safe. Completely out of reach." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Heavy with disbelief, I could almost hear her brain racing, trying to process an act that shattered all assumptions. You can't do that." That's money it was meant to." I let her sputter, the words tangling in her mouth. I had spent decades responding to emergencies, appeasing demands, and quietly absorbing her entitlement. Now, for the first time, the script had been reversed. My calm authority contrasted sharply with her escalating frenzy. Each word from her a confirmation of the shift in power. Her fury built like a wave, escalating to incredulity. How could you? This is outrageous. You've ruined everything. But beneath the anger, I could hear the tremor of helplessness, the recognition that her assumptions about control were false. For the first time, she was not in charge. I felt a steady warmth rise in my chest, not from malice, but from clarity. This was not revenge, it was reclamation. My authority, my autonomy, my right to protect myself and my resources had been asserted in the only way that mattered. I could almost hear the patterns of expectation, manipulation, and entitlement unraveling with every syllable she hissed into the phone. "You've pushed me too far," she said finally, her voice lower, edged with the realization that her world was no longer unchallenged. I let the silence linger for a heartbeat, knowing it carried more weight than any argument I could make. I hung up slowly, setting the phone aside. The house felt different in that moment, lighter, somehow, as though the act of taking control had shifted the atmosphere itself. I walked to the window, looking out over the quiet suburban street, and allowed myself a small, private smile. The predator had finally met resistance, and the world felt steadier for it. For the first time in years, I was not just a mother, a provider, a caregiver. I was a woman fully in command of her own life, and in that quiet satisfaction, I realized the true power of autonomy, respect, and boundaries. Chapter 9, Confrontation begins. The phone would not stop ringing. Every few minutes, another call, another notification pinged across my screen. Clarissa, her husband, texts, emails, each one a fresh wave of urgency, frustration, and barely contained panic. They had been confident for so long that I would comply, that my love and habit of giving would override any hesitation. But that certainty had vanished the moment the funds were out of reach. I sat at the edge of the sofa, laptop open, but my focus was entirely on the barrage of messages. "Mom, this is insane. Please just give us access. We need it now," Clarissa texted. The words were capitalized and bold, a silent attempt to intimidate, to pressure me with fear rather than reason. Her husband chimed in with a call, voice layered with faux calm. "Maren, let's discuss this. It's complicated. We just want what's fair." Fair. The word stung. For years, fair had been defined by their convenience, measured by how much I could provide. Every emergency, every need, every demand had been framed as a test of maternal love. And now, for the first time, I refused to play that role. I didn't answer the calls immediately. I let them stack, the notifications piling up like snow, each one a testament to their expectation of obedience. When I finally picked up, I spoke slowly, deliberately. "Clarissa," I said, "I am not going to authorize any transfers. The account is secure, and I will not be manipulated emotionally or financially." A pause. I could almost hear the disbelief over the line, her voice, sharp and urgent. "Rose Maren, this isn't you. You're overreacting. You've never," I interrupted, calm but firm. "This is exactly me. I am tired of being taken for granted, of having my love and generosity treated as a resource. I will not participate in that pattern anymore." The calls came in rapid succession, her husband now joining, each attempting to reason, cajole, or guilt me. "We've always counted on you. You're making this unnecessarily difficult." But the edge of panic in his voice betrayed the truth they had never expected resistance. My refusal, measured and unwavering, had stripped them of their assumed control. I could feel the pattern I had endured for decades repeating itself in miniature, the attempt to overwhelm, to confuse, to coerce. Only now, I recognized it fully. I refused to bend. Every call, every text was an opportunity for them to see the boundary I had drawn. A boundary rooted in respect for myself, my time, and my resources. I sat back, letting the phone ring unanswered for a moment, letting the silence speak more loudly than any words. The house was quiet except for the occasional notification. And in that quiet, I felt my strength solidify. This was no longer about money. It was about autonomy, dignity, and reclaiming the power that had been quietly eroded over the years. Finally, I opened the laptop again, documenting the messages, the calls, the timeline of their attempts to coerce me. Every record was proof that their sense of entitlement had been met with a firm wall of resistance. I realized that confrontation was not chaos. It was clarity. Every demand they sent, every frantic voice on the line, only reinforced the truth I had discovered. My love was never transactional, and I would not allow it to be exploited. I set the phone aside, a calm settling over me. I had survived their storm of calls and messages without compromise. For the first time, the boundaries I had drawn were respected by one person, and that was myself. I could feel the quiet power in that realization, a steadying force I had not known in years. After the flurry of calls and messages finally subsided, I sank into my favorite armchair by the window, letting the sunlight warm my face. The quiet was different this time, not the uneasy, empty quiet I had grown accustomed to over decades, but a calm that felt deliberate, earned. My mind replayed the past, the endless years of giving, of sacrifice, of bending my life around the expectations of others. And now, for the first time, I could see it clearly. I thought of the small apartment I had moved into after my divorce, the peeling paint and the creaking floors, the modest furnishings that had been enough to survive but never to indulge. Every penny I had saved, every ounce of energy I had given, had gone to support a family that saw my devotion as a resource rather than a relationship. I had believed that love was enough to ensure respect, that my presence and generosity would be reciprocated with care. But love alone had never guaranteed it. The Caribbean trip, the funds, the repeated requests over the years, it all came into focus like a pattern revealed in a sudden burst of light. Each act of giving, each financial decision made in the name of family, had been unquestioned, automatic, a habit disguised as generosity. And yet, the absence of acknowledgement had been a silent, persistent erosion of my self-worth. For decades, I had been invisible, my value measured solely by my willingness to provide. Sitting there, I felt the years of quiet indignities, of subtle manipulations, begin to crystallize into clarity. I realized that my love had been mistaken for obligation, my patience for weakness, and my devotion for acquiescence. But in this clarity, I also saw my strength, the ability to recognize the exploitation, the courage to assert boundaries, and the determination to reclaim my autonomy. It was not just about money. It was about control over my life, over my choices, over my dignity. I had spent so long defining myself through their needs that I had almost forgotten who I was apart from them. Now, with each reflection, I felt pieces of myself return: the woman who had studied late into the night to finish her degree, the one who had faced widowhood with grit, the one who had built a life from scratch after hardship. That woman had never gone away. She had only been waiting, patient, for the moment she could stand again. I let my gaze drift over the room, noticing the little details I had neglected for too long, the books stacked on the shelf, the plants I had kept alive despite my exhaustion, the photographs of moments that were mine, not borrowed from someone else's life. They reminded me that existence, for the first time in years, could be centered on me, on my choices, and on my joy. In that stillness, I understood the fundamental difference between love and exploitation. Love nurtures, respects, and reciprocates. Exploitation assumes, consumes, and disregards. For decades, I had been offering the former to those who demanded the latter. Now, for the first time, I could choose to give only when it was genuine, and with boundaries firmly in place. The weight I had carried for years, expectations, guilt, unspoken obligations felt lighter, almost liberating. I could see myself clearly, separate from the demands and manipulations, worthy of care and respect without needing to prove it through sacrifice. And in that moment, I smiled quietly, savoring the clarity that only comes when the fog of obligation lifts, and the self you thought invisible finally comes into focus. The next morning, I called Clara, my neighbor and friend for over 20 years. She had been a steady presence in my life, a quiet observer of the routines, triumphs, and heartbreaks that shaped my days. When she answered, I heard concern immediately, but there was no judgment, only a readiness to listen. Clara, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. I need help. This isn't just about money anymore. I need someone to help me see clearly what's been happening all these years. Clara agreed to come over immediately. Within an hour, she was at my door, her presence reassuring in a way that reminded me of all the times I had leaned on trusted friends when my family's demands felt insurmountable. She brought her calm, methodical nature and a notebook, ready to record every detail I could recall. As I recounted the story, the transfers, the lies, the exclusions, the relentless demands, I felt the tension within me begin to shift. It was no longer a storm trapped in my chest. It was a narrative I could share, organize, and, ultimately, act upon. Together, we began to catalog the evidence. Screenshots of bank transfers, messages, emails, records of calls, receipts from trips, and documents from past loans all went into neat folders. Each item was a testament to patterns I had once thought trivial, but were now glaringly clear repeated exploitation, disguised as need. Emotional manipulation, masked as affection. Every detail I shared felt like a small act of liberation. After several hours, Clara leaned back and said, "This is serious. Maren, you've been manipulated for years. It's not just financial, it's emotional. You deserve protection, not guilt." Her words were a balm, a confirmation of what I already suspected, but had been afraid to admit fully the exploitation was real, and the time to confront it with support had come. I knew I needed more than a friend's guidance. I needed someone with expertise, someone who could navigate the legal landscape and ensure my autonomy and assets were safeguarded. That afternoon, I called a lawyer recommended by Clara, Nidia Herrera, who specialized in cases of elder abuse and family financial exploitation. The secretary's voice was professional but warm, and she promised a consultation that very week. When Nidia arrived, she brought a calm authority and an understanding that immediately put me at ease. She listened to the entire story without interruption, taking notes and asking precise, informed questions. "Maren," she said finally, looking directly at me, "what you're describing is not uncommon, and you have every right to protect yourself. We can ensure that your finances, your decisions, and your dignity are all respected, and we can hold those responsible accountable if necessary." I felt a surge of relief and validation. For decades, I had internalized guilt, believing that love required endless sacrifice. Now, with allies who understood the legal and emotional dimensions of what had happened, I could see a path forward. We devised a plan: secure my remaining assets, gather all documentation of transfers and communications, and establish a clear record of repeated manipulations. The goal was not revenge, it was protection and assertion of my autonomy. By evening, Clara and Nydia had helped me compile a thorough, chronological record of everything that had occurred over the past several years. As I looked at the growing stack of evidence, I felt the first real sense of empowerment I had experienced in decades. The storm of fear and uncertainty that had once dominated my days had been replaced by focus and strategy. For the first time, I was not alone in confronting the truth. I stood at my window that night, watching the city lights shimmer across the streets below, and felt a sense of clarity settle over me. The betrayal was real, but so was my agency. I was no longer isolated, with allies at my side. The next steps, though challenging, were mine to decide, deliberate, and control. The next morning, sunlight spilled into my living room, illuminating the stacks of papers and folders I had spread across the dining table. Each document represented a piece of a puzzle I was only now beginning to assemble with clarity. Bank statements, receipts, messages, and emails, all meticulously organized by date, by type, by transaction. I ran my fingers over the edges of the folders, feeling the weight of years of giving, of sacrifice, of silent compliance, now transformed into evidence of patterns I could no longer ignore. Clara arrived shortly after, her presence steady, a quiet reassurance in the whirlwind of thoughts racing through my mind. "Where do we start?" she asked. Surveying the organized chaos, I gestured toward the first stack. "From the beginning," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "Every transfer, every request, every excuse, it all matters." Together, we worked through the documentation. Each page revealed the extent of the manipulation loans taken in my name, trips I had funded, emergency funds I had contributed without hesitation. The repetition became clear, the patterns undeniable. I had been treated as a resource, a backup plan, a never-ending source of support, and the realization stung even as it galvanized me. By midday, Nydia Herrera joined us, her expression one of professional focus, yet softened by genuine empathy. She examined the timeline Clara and I had begun compiling, her eyes scanning the sequences, noting the frequency and method of each exploit. "Maren, this is thorough," she said, her tone both reassuring and authoritative. "You've documented everything that establishes both the financial and emotional context. This isn't just numbers, it's a pattern of manipulation. We can use this to assert your boundaries and protect your assets." I felt a mixture of relief and empowerment. For decades, I had assumed that love required sacrifice without question. Now, with the documentation laid bare, I understood that love does not demand invisibility, nor does devotion require exploitation. I was preparing not only for confrontation, but for the assertion of my own dignity, a defense of both my finances and my autonomy. Hours passed as we refined the timeline, cross-referenced statements with messages, and built a narrative that would withstand scrutiny. Each step was deliberate, methodical, and necessary. I realized that preparation itself was a form of control, a way to reclaim agency that had long been eroded. Every item cataloged, every note made, every detail double-checked reinforced my sense of certainty and purpose. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, I reviewed the folders once more, each stack a testament to years of unnoticed labor and unacknowledged devotion. I felt a quiet strength settle over me, The kind that comes not from confrontation itself, but from knowing you are ready, ready to stand, ready to assert, ready to protect what is rightfully yours. I paused to sip my coffee, gazing out the window at the street below, imagining the calm before the inevitable storm. The calls and messages would come, the arguments would flare, and the pressure would mount. But I was no longer a passive participant in my own life. I had chosen strategy over impulse, preparation over panic, and evidence over emotion alone. The night fell with a sense of quiet purpose, every document in place, every timeline verified, every folder secure. I knew that the next steps, though unpredictable, would be met with clarity and control. The battle ahead was not just about money. It was about respect, dignity, and finally, a life reclaimed. The phone rang incessantly that morning, each buzz a small hammer against the walls of my resolve. Clarissa's name flashed across the screen, followed by a slew of notifications, texts, emails, voicemails, all urgent, insistent, and emotionally charged. She was trying every angle I had learned to anticipate over the years: guilt, fear, flattery, and subtle threats disguised as concern. I let the calls go to voicemail, taking a deep breath, centering myself before responding. Finally, I picked up, her voice, familiar yet strained, cut through the line like a sharp breeze. Maren, I don't understand. Why would you do this? We're family. I thought you loved us. I paused for a moment, listening carefully. I could hear the tremor beneath her accusations, the thread of desperation woven through her words. I do love you, Clarissa, I said evenly, deliberately slow, but love does not require me to compromise my safety, my dignity, or my boundaries. I am not your ATM, nor am I a servant to your expectations. There was a gasp on the other end, a mixture of shock and indignation. You can't just, after everything I've done for you, everything we've shared. Her voice rose, teetering between fury and pleading. I've always counted on you. How could you be so selfish? I let her words wash over me without flinching. The familiar rhythm of manipulation, the escalating guilt, the reframing of my decisions as moral failings was clear. But this time, I was prepared. I had laid out my documents, my timeline, my evidence of years of unquestioned support that had been met with entitlement rather than gratitude. I didn't need to justify my choices emotionally. The facts were my shield. Clarissa, I said firmly, I am not being selfish. I am being responsible for myself. I have spent decades supporting you, often at great personal cost. Now I am choosing to protect myself, just as I would have protected any of my own interests. Her tone shifted, more urgent, almost panicked. But we needed that money. We planned the trip. I don't know what we're going to do. The edge of desperation was unmistakable. She was testing me, pushing to see if fear or guilt would override my resolve. I let a calm, measured silence settle over the line. My own heartbeat slowed, steady and deliberate. The trip, the plans, the expectations, they were never mine to carry alone. You had assumed I would always provide, without question, without boundaries. That assumption ends today. I will not be coerced. For several moments, her voice wavered, caught between frustration and disbelief. I could hear her searching for the familiar compliance that had defined our relationship for so long. It wasn't there. I was present. I was assertive. I was unwavering. Finally, she let out a long sigh, one that carried both resignation and frustration. You've changed, she said quietly, almost to herself. Yes, I agreed. Calmly, I have. And this change is long overdue. I hung up and set the phone aside, feeling the familiar surge of empowerment, the clarity that comes from resisting manipulation. For the first time in decades, I had not just drawn a boundary, I had enforced it. I had faced the storm of expectation, guilt, and emotional pressure, and I had stood firm. As I sat back in my chair, letting the quiet settle around me, I realized that this moment was more than just about money or a trip. It was about asserting my autonomy, reclaiming my life, and demonstrating that love does not demand invisibility or subjugation. I had survived the test of manipulation, and in that survival, I found a strength that had been dormant for far too long. The day arrived with a quiet, almost deceptive calm. I had dressed carefully, choosing a navy blazer and simple blouse, professional yet assertive, as if my clothes themselves could carry the weight of my resolve. When I arrived at the cafe where Clarissa had insisted we meet, she was already there, fidgeting with her phone, eyes darting up every few seconds as if expecting me to collapse in guilt the moment I appeared. I took a deep breath and walked in, letting my gaze meet hers directly. She looked up, startled, and then almost smug, as though she anticipated my hesitation. But there was none. I seated myself across from her, letting the quiet stretch, forcing her to fill it. "Maren," she began, voice tense. We need to talk about the money, the trip. You can't just..." I raised my hand gently, cutting her off. "Clarissa, I'm here to talk, but not to negotiate or justify. I am here to set the record straight and make boundaries clear. For decades, I have been treated as a resource, expected to provide, expected to sacrifice without acknowledgement or respect. That ends now." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of disbelief crossing her features. "But it was all for you. You've always been a part of everything. You knew the plans, the expenses." I shook my head slowly, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease as I spoke. "No, I funded the trips, the gifts, the emergencies. I supported your education, your wedding, your lifestyle, often at great personal cost. And yet, I have been excluded, manipulated, and treated as invisible. Love is not measured by how much I can give or how much I am taken for granted. It is measured by respect, acknowledgement, and reciprocity. And those were absent." Her husband appeared suddenly, joining the table with a calm that seemed forced, as if trying to regain authority. "Maren, surely this can be resolved quietly. We just need..." I held up a hand to him as well. "No. There is no negotiation when it comes to my dignity or autonomy. I am not here to appease guilt or fear. I am here to assert my life, my decisions, and my boundaries. I will not be coerced, intimidated, or exploited." Clarissa's lips pressed into a thin line. I could see the shift in her demeanor, the subtle panic creeping in. She had always relied on the assumption that I would comply, that my love and habit of giving would override all hesitation. But that assumption had crumbled. Her attempts at emotional manipulation, pleas, flattery, veiled threats fell flat against my calm certainty. "I understand this is hard to accept," I continued, voice steady, "but you need to see it clearly. Your mother is not a resource to be spent at will. Your expectations have no power here." For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. Her eyes, usually so quick to shift with every cue, lingered, searching for the familiar compliance that was gone. Her hands trembled slightly as she put her phone down, the tension in her jaw betraying her disbelief. The power she had wielded for years, the control she thought inherent in my devotion, had evaporated. I leaned back, feeling the gravity of the moment settle over the table. This was no longer about money, no longer about the trip, no longer about past frustrations. It was about recognition, about finally being seen, heard, and respected for who I was, beyond the expectations of my family. Clarissa's husband exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging just slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. The silence that followed was tense, but purposeful, filled with the weight of truth finally laid bare. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to argue further. My stance, my clarity, my refusal to be exploited, all of it spoke louder than any words they could offer. As I gathered my coat and prepared to leave, I felt a quiet, powerful satisfaction. I had been heard. I had been acknowledged. And for the first time in decades, I knew that my autonomy and dignity were intact, respected, and finally, unassailable. Chapter 15. Victory and Validation. The morning sun poured through the blinds as I stepped into the office. The quiet hum of the city below contrasting sharply with the storm I had weathered for months. Today was the culmination of everything I had worked toward: the strategic planning, the documentation, the careful assembling of allies who understood the truth of what had been done to me. For the first time in decades, I felt fully in control. Clarissa and her husband arrived shortly after, their confident facades already fraying. The moment they realized the extent of the evidence I had compiled, their expressions shifted, a subtle panic flaring behind eyes that had long expected obedience. The air was thick with tension as I placed the neatly organized folders on the table, each one a record of every transfer, every request, every lie and manipulation they had attempted over the years. "I've laid everything out," I said calmly, my voice carrying a weight I had never allowed myself before. "Everything you relied upon me to ignore, everything you assumed I would forgive, is here. This is not just money. It's proof of patterns, of exploitation, of attempts to control and diminish me." Their reactions were immediate. Clarissa's lips pressed into a tight line. Her usual flurry of emotional argument cut short as she absorbed the magnitude of what I had presented. Her husband's posture stiffened, his attempts to interject silenced by the authority in my tone. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. For decades, they had assumed they could push, guilt, and manipulate, confident in my compliance. Now they faced the unmistakable reality I was no longer that woman. As I watched the realization settle over their faces, a quiet, profound satisfaction rose in me. It was not a vindictive joy, but the pure triumph of justice and clarity. Every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every sacrifice made under the weight of expectation had led to this. I was no longer the passive provider, no longer the silent victim. I was seen, acknowledged, and validated not just legally, but morally and emotionally. The room seemed to hold its breath as I continued, articulating boundaries with precision, calmly detailing the measures I had taken to protect myself. From this point forward, my resources, my time, and my emotional energy are mine, I said. They will be respected, or I will remove myself entirely. No more assumptions. No more exploitation. Clarissa's shoulders slumped, the first genuine sign of helplessness I had seen in years. She could no longer control the narrative, no longer manipulate the outcome, no longer wield my love as leverage. And in that moment, I understood the full weight of what I had reclaimed. It was more than money or acknowledgement. It was the restoration of my identity, my dignity, and my agency. As the meeting concluded, I gathered my belongings with a sense of calm triumph. Each step felt lighter, freer, and purposeful. The months of preparation, the careful planning, the courage to stand firm, all had culminated in a victory that was as emotional as it was moral. I had faced the storm of manipulation, resisted, and emerged whole, unshaken, and fully seen. For the first time in decades, I smiled quietly to myself, savoring the clarity, the power, and the knowledge that what was always mine, my life, my dignity, my autonomy had been reclaimed. The first morning in my newly renovated apartment felt like waking up for the first time in decades. Sunlight streamed through the freshly painted windows, casting patterns on walls that I had chosen, shelves that I had arranged, and a space that belonged entirely to me. The scent of coffee filled the air, richer somehow because it was brewed for myself, not for anyone else's schedule or expectation. I moved through the rooms slowly, savoring the freedom to decide how everything should be. The old sofa that had been threadbare and sagging was replaced with a simple, elegant couch where I could sit comfortably and read. The kitchen, once cluttered and functional only for necessity, now gleamed, stocked with utensils and ingredients I actually enjoyed using. Every detail was a reflection of my choices, my tastes, and my life as I wanted to live it. For the first time, I allowed myself to explore hobbies I had postponed for years. I set up a small art corner, a space for watercolor painting, a medium I had loved in my youth but abandoned in the endless cycle of caretaking. My first strokes were shaky, my colors a bit chaotic, but I didn't mind. The joy wasn't in perfection. It was in reclaiming a part of myself I had set aside for the comfort of others. Travel, too, became a deliberate choice. I booked a short trip to the mountains outside Denver, a place I had always wanted to visit but never felt entitled to because my energy and resources were always devoted to others. Driving along the winding roads, the pine-scented air filling the car, I realized how long it had been since I had moved through the world purely for pleasure, curiosity, and personal discovery. Each mile I traveled felt like a small liberation from the decades of expectation that had shaped my life. Evenings were spent quietly, savoring books, music, and the rare pleasure of doing absolutely nothing. I no longer calculated every expense against someone else's needs. I could buy the occasional treat, indulge in a new recipe, or simply sit with a cup of tea and watch the city lights flicker below, knowing I was accountable only to myself. Friends began to notice the change, the lightness in my step, the confidence in my voice. Conversations were no longer transactional or constrained by obligation. They were genuine, shared for connection rather than duty. I laughed more freely, spoke more honestly, and felt the steady pulse of independence settle into my bones. And yet, amidst all the freedom, I felt a deep sense of gratitude not for the years I had given away, but for the resilience those years had forged in me. Every challenge, every disappointment, every act of being overlooked had led me here to a life where my choices mattered, my voice was heard, and my presence was valued first by myself. As I poured a final cup of coffee and sat by the window, I looked out at the city that had always been my backdrop, and I felt the quiet thrill of possibility. I was no longer bound by expectation or obligation. For the first time in decades, I was living entirely for me, and the world vibrant, open, and filled with opportunity was mine to explore. The community center smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood as I stepped inside, carrying a stack of notes and my own experiences to share. The room was filled with women of all ages, each with her own story of sacrifice, manipulation, and quiet endurance. I could see their hesitant eyes, the walls they had built around themselves, and I felt a kinship that transcended words. I spoke slowly, deliberately, recounting the years I had given, the moments I had been overlooked, and the day I finally drew the line. I watched as faces shifted from skepticism to recognition, the subtle spark of understanding igniting. Questions followed, practical, emotional, pointed, and I answered with honesty, guiding them through steps to protect their autonomy, manage finances, and reclaim respect without guilt. Walking home later, the evening breeze against my face, I reflected on the life I had rebuilt, every decision to stand firm, every boundary enforced, every dollar and ounce of energy reclaimed had contributed not just to my own dignity, but to the possibility of empowering others. I realized my legacy was not wealth or possessions. It was the courage, the self-respect, and the lessons I now shared. For the first time in decades, I understood the depth of strength I had cultivated and the quiet power of being fully, unapologetically myself.